And so Halo Quartet, the founding group of this organization, is the first quartet of African-American singers to compete on the national stage of any barbershop organization. And we have used this milestone as a platform to explore the possibilities of how music and its social history can create community, hold space for dialogue, and heal the world for a more united and peaceful future. And Race and Real Talk is our unique community music therapy program, which uses the listening and singing experience of barbershop music to facilitate fruitful dialogue about racism in the United States. And today's discussion will be a bit different, as we will, instead of presenting the full metaphor of our Race and Real Talk framework, we will just be spending some time together exploring and sharing perspectives on the possibilities of renewed allyship and connection between Jewish and African American communities. Our panelists today include Sam Dubrinsky, Donetta Hopkins, and Maria Thompson Corley. And our fourth panelist today had some engagements that became more involved than expected. So we will hold space with this group of three wonderful people who have taken time to be with us today as part of our discussion. And we also have Portia Pitts with us today, helping to manage with the observers who are with us today. And you all who are present to witness the dialogue, you may share some additional questions and comments with the discussion group in the chat. And Portia will share those questions with the group to address and consider. And so we welcome you and thank you for joining us today. Niambi?
Okay, greetings everybody and welcome. We're glad that you're here with us today. And again, my name is Niambi Powell and I am co-facilitating with Shana this afternoon for this Race and Real Talk event. And we're glad to have you here. So I will go ahead and jump into our first question to pose to our panel guests today. And the first question is, what are some values within the Jewish community and within the African American community that you're aware of that have served the people within those respective communities? I think I'll start with asking Sam if he'll start us off in the conversation and share.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here and thanks for including me in this very important conversation. The value that I'm going to share it in Hebrew. It's called Tikkun Olam, which translates to repairing the world, which is a belief, a central belief in Judaism that revolves around our interpretation of the world and protecting our own community, but also working to protect others and recognizing that we are part of something that is much bigger than just ourselves. So that to me came to mind immediately when you asked that question. And I also think, one that may be a little bit more obvious is resiliency and ability to persevere.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. How about let's jump to, I'll go in the direction that they're displayed to me. Maria, would you like to share your reflection on that question, please?
Actually, resilience was one of the things that I also thought of, but I think the fact that we are very artistic people, creative people, of course, to do what you mentioned, Sam, creativity is central, but I think that there has been a way that music, I'm a musician, and art has been something that has drawn people together, even in ways that they perhaps didn't intend. So I think our deep creativity and spirituality and both those things, I think, have fed into the resilience, the ability to alchemize pain into art, and also very much so that hope that we have all taken from tending to be societies that organize around a divine being.
Beautiful. Donetta.
I think the value, one value is that of community, a sense of community from, I think, in my own personal observations from both the Jewish community and Black people, the value of community is super important because um, when you have that sense of community, I think it kind of feeds and enhances that whole idea of being resilient people and being able to navigate the world in that way. Whereas if you are alone, I mean, there are things you can navigate alone, but I think there's power in numbers. So community is one of those values that I think is super important.
Beautiful. I'm hearing this theme of resilience, creativity, and community, and even the idea of, let's see, the creativity being one of the resources that supports and sustains the resilience through the different experiences that African American folks and communities and Jewish folks and communities have endured in their experience in the United States and other parts of the world and different places in time. And I'm also looking at, because our fourth panelist had shared some of her reflections with me, and I see that there's a couple of similarities here too that inspire this other question. And she says, her name is Lisa Book, so we'll treat her like she's here. Thank you, Lisa. You're here in spirit. And she shares, that there's similar soulfulness, expressiveness in music, a similar background from being kicked out of one's homeland, features exaggerated and make spectacle of, so the caricaturization in the eyes of groups outside of one's own, wanting to learn and experience through music and dance, which is interesting because it's one thing for just the music itself and its qualities of soulfulness and expressiveness. It's another that to view it as a means of learning. And she also, the family values and styles of humor, the darkness that is maybe characteristic in some of our shared humor. And so I guess this leads me to want to draw out a little bit more from this idea of your respective experiences with creativity in your communities, and how have you seen that contribute to the resilience that you have sustained, that we have sustained, however you want to put it.
Well, I think, expressiveness is in some way, I mean, expressing pain is, I mentioned alchemizing, but it's just you either internalize it and it eats you alive, or you find a way to express it, and to express it in a way that goes down through the ages is something beautiful, or even that reads as joyful. I mean, if you talk about the blues, for example, I mean, the humor, we mentioned the humor. I mean, these sorts of things are just part of the human condition. As I said, either you suppress and it eats you alive, or you express. And the fact that it's been these musical expressions or dance or whatever kind of artistic expressions are then shared is not just a way of communicating what we've gone through, but also a way of inviting other people into maybe having a more empathetic, perhaps empathy. I mean, I think obviously to create community, it's hard to be a community if there's no empathy or connection on some level, other than just like what you can put on paper, so yeah, that's one way that I would say creativity perhaps has fed resilience.
Thank you for that, Maria. Any other thoughts on that? Our creativity and that interplay in relationship with the resilience that our communities share. And even our approach to, how we repair the world, right?
I will also say that, I mean, if you look at jazz and other kinds of music that, that has been also a meeting place, in addition to, the marches and that sort of thing, of connecting our two forms of creativity. I mean, if you think of different musicians who've, I mean, I come from the classical music world, so you think of, Gershwin and even people who weren't Jewish, but taking taking the music. Well, I don't want to go there with that, but I mean, I think the admiration of and people making music together in groups, I think is something that can be emulated and, has been a way of people meeting. I mean, I've heard of orchestras for example, in Israel that have been formed with young people who are Palestinian and young people who are Jewish, and having them make music together is just a way of seeing each other as, you're creating harmony, literally. So,
Yeah. Any other thoughts on?
Donetta or Sam?
I'm reminded of a recent book that I read called Bittersweet, which talks about leading a melancholy life and how in melancholy there is so much beauty. And many of the examples that were used were individuals from the Jewish community, individuals from the Black community, and their ability to share that bittersweetness or that melancholy through the arts in whatever way that was, because it's just this deep feeling. It's not even necessarily the words, it's just being able to express that in a way where someone can feel even the tiniest part of it. And it's such a beautiful concept. And I know I am not doing it justice, but it really struck me just hearing what you said, Maria. It allows for a shared experience in whatever way you're coming to that experience.
I mean, I think that, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
No, you're talking and talking. But I mean, I think I'm not saying that there are lots of groups in the world that have been in their way marginalized, reviled, but as far as being universally reviled, I think that is something that, as far as that well of sadness and it's anger, but I heard somewhere that anger was either hurt or pain or fear. Hurt or fear were the two things. And being marginalized in this just pervasive way, of course, the fear is that, are these people coming for you and when? And they see, because they've done it before. And of course the hurt of, it's so unjustified. I mean, why do people keep doing this? I mean, what have we done other than exist? And so I imagine that's a very profound book, because I mean, you have to keep doing what you do with that thing in the background, that baggage in the background of just how many people, and not knowing who they are exactly necessarily, but who have held these views that have been the characterization, as she said, just put forth and put forth and put forth in so many different ways, even subtle. I think of a lot of the Disney movies, and my son loves Disney movies, but you see who are the villains, and Jafar, you see Jafar, and he's darker than everybody else, and whatever the culture is, that usually there's something there that is just put in the back of people's minds. So yeah, it's just it's a common wound, I would say.
Yeah, I think I'm really resonating with this idea, I think that's coming through, this shared characteristic of our communities, about the beauty of our art, the genius of our art, the hilarity of our art. We're from music to comedy, right? Being it's one side of the same coin, and the flip side, that other side also contain the pain of our lived experiences of marginalization and discrimination and all of that, and how they're two sides of the same coin for both of our communities. And that I really hear that coming through with what you're sharing.
And on that note also of that being a shared characteristic of the quality of our art, and this is a question for all of the panelists, can you describe to what, in briefly, in what ways you engage with it in your own life, the artistic expression in music and what have you of what you identify as your community or acknowledge as your community, and how, to what extent you are aware of and engaged with the artistic expressions of the other community represented in this dialogue. Is that clear as a question?
If you can reframe that for me, that would help me a little bit.
Okay, sure. So as an African-American woman, you have your experiences with African-American art, musical traditions, and so forth. I'm interested in what that looks like for you in a nutshell. And I would like to know to what extent you feel you have had experience with engaging with Jewish art, music, and other forms of creative expression.
I hate to keep talking. I mean, I'm a European classically trained musician. I have over the last few years intentionally said Western European classical training because, of course, there are classical musics from all over the world, and one is not synonymous with all classical musics, whatever classical music means. But you know, I mean, in the course of going through conservatories, etc., I mean, you encounter a lot of composers who are of Jewish descent. I mean, I didn't encounter so many composers in that realm who were of African descent until relatively recently. But I mean, the traditions of, I was born in Jamaica, my mom is from Bermuda. And so, you know, all those kinds of music, whether it was the soca or the, you know, calypso and reggae, I mean, formed a big part of my formative years, along with a lot of the African-American music, whether it was, you know, listening to Mahalia Jackson or, you know, these sorts of, or jazz legends. My dad was really into that, and, you know, people, so I had a really wide range. The more popular or not, I wouldn't say popular music that had Jewish background. I mean, you know, I became familiar with klezmer music. I don't call myself an expert, but, you know, in the course of playing with clarinetists and, you know, having people just expose me to some different things. But I'll say that, you know, for me, my experience with that has been primarily in the realm of written music, in, you know, of music by people who are of Jewish descent is mainly written down. And then my experience with African American or from the diaspora has been less scripted in general, like less written down. So it's mine.
Well, I will say that in thinking about the question you just posed, Shauna, I have had little to no direct exposure, I think, to music that there are of Jewish descent, you know, composers of Jewish descent. My musical experience is certainly not as vast as Maria, but my background is certainly within the gospel arena, dealing with listening to a lot of gospel music and performing some gospel music, and certainly the barbershop side of things, which also in a lot of ways, well, not a lot of ways, but borrowed from us in that regard. So that question brought up for me that, hey, wait a minute, this is something that I need to explore. I need to find some outreach or some ways to get my hands on or get more exposed to music that is from musicians of Jewish descent. So that's an area of growth for me. So thank you for posing that question.
I agree. I'm in the same boat. any exploration that I've done has not been intentional necessarily. So I have a lot of work to do there.
Thank you all for.
And so do I. I mean, I know what I know, but I'm sure that there's a lot deeper. I could dive into the more folk traditions, and and it's not like it was intentional. It's like, Felix Mendelssohn, I mean, he converted, for the reasons that it was just better for him. George Gershwin, of course, the Rhapsody in Blue. If you are a Black musician, that's kind of the first thing they'll ask you to play, or has been, because of the jazz influences, and his Concerto in F. So it is sort of someone who was in his way borrowing, or I mean, I don't know, I'm sort of tap dancing around something, because I think he was a brilliant composer, and I don't have any doubt about that. I do know that people of his era who were Black, who, for who that music was maybe a little bit more theirs, if you can put a fence around music, because that's a whole other discussion, and I'm not sure that you can. I guess the thing has been sort of like, who gets to make a living with the music, because of their talent, and who doesn't. And I think that, that has, sort of jumping into something that has been, a source of conflict, is just like, who gets to make a living with that particular style of music, who gets paid to do it, and who doesn't get paid as much to do it, whether or not it was something that they were more instrumental in creating. So I don't know. I think I'm going on a tangent. I think humanity, all humans have within them the ability to, I guess if you're going to be a capitalist nation, or say capitalism is what you're doing, then, that's the principles of that are what they are. And so you'll have some people who will be more dedicated to trying to make sure everything is as fair as possible, and you'll get some other people who are dedicated to just making a buck. And it doesn't matter who they're making a buck off of. So I'm not saying it's necessarily like racial exploitation. There's intra and interracial exploitation. Whenever you have humans involved, that can happen. But yeah, again, when I talk about Gershwin, you'll know, everybody might know Gershwin, they might not know William Grant still, maybe they do now. Or William Dawson, I saw one of his pieces was programmed somewhere on the Philadelphia Orchestra. And obviously money isn't the be all and end all to say whether somebody is good or whether they're not good at what they're doing. But those sorts of rewards and where they have been distributed, I think, is part of the reason that people have had, some of the issues that people raise. And I don't think you should generalize about, like, if somebody is of Jewish descent and they ripped you off, then that means everybody's going to rip you off. If someone is of African American descent and they robbed you, that all Black people are robbers. But I think that what people fixate on, again, because of the way that, society, media, and it's very intentional things, as you read more and more, you see how you were talking the next thing about white supremacy, and just this whole idea of pitting us against each other and creating tropes in the media and all these sorts of things. So, it's hard for everybody to just say, no, that's a trope that's been put in our head, as opposed to, well, there must be something to that. Anyway.
Well, thank you, Maria. No, like you've actually, in kind of in dovetailing us into the next question for the panel, this idea, what are the obstacles, do you think, that you've observed, or that, have been made themselves apparent to you, or maybe are less apparent, but are starting to, come to the forefront of your consciousness about, those values or those obstacles to sharing the respective values, and the values that actually are shared too, right? From each of our communities. Maria talked, mentioning about, media and even our particular system of government, you know, as playing a big role in that. Like, you know, what are your thoughts on that? You know, both on those two things perhaps, and then other things that you might observe as obstacles, you know, at that larger scale, but even like internal, like personal obstacles that you may have observed.
Um, I think for me, I go back to that whole business, or that matter of community being such a strong value, and listening to everything that's been said thus far. I think a potential obstacle that we have is the individual being willing to be a part of, or be involved in, or be connected to the community, to the point that they can be bold, be humble, be connected, but also be about cause preservation rather than simply about self-preservation. While I know it's important for us to be concerned with individual ourselves, until we can be willing to stand collectively, and sometimes we have to be willing to stand alone for cause preservation, and that's hard. So I think that can be a potential obstacle. If we're not willing to stand for something, then we're going to fall for anything, because it goes back to, well, I got mine, I'm going to protect me. But what about the cause that's bigger than you? What about the community that's bigger than you? So that's one of the things that I think is a potential obstacle, in that we've got to shift our thinking from it's all about me to it's all about us. And we are in this thing together, and let's survive and do and be together.
Mm-hmm. That's really powerful, I think, Donetta. This because you're speaking to this, or I hear you speaking to, you know, the kind of the dominant cultural value of like individualism and preservation of the self, and how that creates a lot of tension and can draw us away from the preservation of the collective, right, and the cause, as you say. And I think that's I think that can, yeah, that presents as and shows up as an obstacle for everybody on an individual level, like to some degree. Thank you for bringing that up.
I mean, I think this idea of the zero-sum game, you know, that has become sort of a prevailing idea, that just, you know, there can't be enough for everybody. So, you know, I got to make sure I got mine, because, you know, I can't worry about them because they're just going to pull me down from getting mine, you know. And then once I've got mine, I see those people who have even more than I had. So if I can get up there, you know, a few more other people may have even less. But it's not really the way that it has to work. I mean, I do think that, you know, the aspiration for, I mean, everybody obviously isn't going to be a billionaire, and or even a millionaire, and I don't think everybody needs all that anyway. I mean, just the lifestyles of the rich and famous, kind of glorification of getting, you know, these extravagant this and that. And how do you do that? You know, well, you got to step on a few little people along the way. You know, you have to focus on that aspect of things in order to achieve that aspect of things. And, you know, is that worthy? I mean, you know, I want to look after my kids, and if you're, you know, I want to feel comfortable, but what is considered to be comfortable has, we have to look at that. I mean, yeah, everybody doesn't need to be driving a whatever is the current status car, and it would be better if we weren't all thinking that was how you have made it, you know. But it isn't, it's never been a zero-sum game. I mean, if everybody, you know, the more that each person is allowed to participate in the way that they can participate, then it's like you're creating more symbiotic organisms, you know, as opposed to just trying to build a fence around, you know, you and your exclusive ability to thrive. Like, in everybody shouldn't be able to have at least some bit of thriving. But anyway.
Yeah, I think it's that scarcity mindset that lends itself to the pitting of our two communities against one another, which unfortunately I saw a lot of growing up in Birmingham, Alabama. And I think that the scarcity and the fear and potentially that anger really drove those issues that pitted us against one another. And I think about, so I grew up in Birmingham, and the rabbi of the synagogue that I grew up in was Rabbi Milton Grafman, who was an important leader in the Jewish community within the civil rights era. And he gives a Rosh Hashanah sermon, which is the day after the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church. And he stood at the pulpit and said, I haven't written anything, and I am angry, and I'm angry because I'm standing here by myself in support of the Black community, and my congregation is being critical of me. And it's this really beautiful and powerful and ugly sermon as well. And I just think about what Danetta said in terms of being willing to stand alone. And if we ask ourselves, truly, are we willing to stand alone, not just on behalf of our community, but on behalf of both of our communities? What are our answers? What are our answers, both as individuals and as within our community?
Another obstacle that just kind of came to mind, and I know we all know this, is just the sheer appearance of one another. You know, when people see a Black person coming, there's no way of getting around that or hiding that or changing. You see what you see. But then when you are, say you're going somewhere and you're with a Jewish person, to the outside eye, someone won't know, most likely, that this is a Jewish person. They will just see white. And so the obstacle there is that oftentimes the treatment is going to be different, and the benefit of the doubt is going to be given just by sheer appearance to this person who is white versus this Black person. So I think from that appearance standpoint, then it becomes a bit angering and frustrating for the person of color, because it's like, if everything else is equal with these two people, with the exception of what you see coming, there's still going to be that difference that happens externally to you. And so that is upsetting and angering. And so going back to what I was saying earlier, I would want and hope that the person who's accompanying me would be willing to stand for the cause versus just about the self. Because I remember hearing in, I forget which movie that was, a historical movie, but I remember hearing someone say to another white person say to another white man, how are you going to call yourself a good white Christian? And then that individual saying, I'm Jewish. And so that was kind of like, get over yourself, I'm Jewish, and I'm not associated with you. So in that instant, I feel like they were about a cause, and they were okay with and wanted to be associated and connected with this Black person, whereas this other individual was saying, you shouldn't be. I think I rambled a bit, but hopefully.
No, I really love that reflection, because it's inspiring 3 points that have kind of come out. For one, our other Jewish participant who couldn't come today, Lisa Book, one of the things that she also said was, she said an obstacle is when someone like Whoopi calls this a white problem, and when Jews don't recognize observable difference of Black people, and that we can assimilate easier, except if we're wearing a yarmulke. So, you know, this was a quick text version of her reflection of that. But so that the appearance of the problems being separate, and therefore making the people become separate, and the resentment that ensues from that constructed, imposed division between and among any group of people, but certainly in this particular case, African-American people and Jewish people. And it's interesting, you talk about the tap dance that you've been trying to do around this, because it's funny. It's not like I did not know that George Gershwin was Jewish. Of course I knew that, but I always forget, especially when I'm thinking about Porgy and Bess, in my subconscious just tells them this white man took a style of traditional appropriated a style of Black music and made so much profit off of it. And it's also kind of a funny story, because at the same time, he says, well, I only want this performed by Black singers. Now, how much of that had to do with a standpoint of equity and who's getting to share a narrative? That's debatable. We do know that it has to do with his belief about how particular bodily instruments are used in terms of the voice. And so in the singing community of classical singers, there's a bit of a love-hate relationship with it. And on the one hand, of course, like, it is great music, and it's a lot of African-American singers' foot in the doors to places like the Metropolitan Opera and other big opera houses and opportunities and so forth. And at the same time, it is a white man's story put to music about Black people through a white person's lens, which is its own fascinating and interesting sort of thing to begin with. But it's like there is, that's one example of a relationship that has existed. And a version of the resentment in a shared space that has persisted relative to those identities, and how that also reinforces this phenomenon of perception of comparative suffering if it comes to, like, well, am I going to help my own or your own? And there are some interesting implications too, perhaps, about what it even says about white supremacy, because even when one starts to look at community practice and subcultural practices, and even the structure of and characteristics of language, and how much emphasis is put on the individual versus the community, and what that means about the social and even literal physical environments and ecosystems in which people navigate and interact with one another, and those kinds of things about what does it mean about trying to be what humanity needs to be to really be a part of this world, part of the earth, and part of one another, and to dismantle these structures that don't serve anybody in the long run. So looking at, this picture of, like, we have these value systems that can serve the bigger picture, where white supremacy ultimately is detrimental to the whole, not even just to the groups that we identify as marginalized and who are marginalized and oppressed, but it does not serve ultimately the white people and even those with the most power in the long run too. And then, so I think that's another good opportunity and segue into what the next question is, which is, how can you imagine these communities, our communities, sharing their respective values and strengths with one another to eradicate these obstacles?
Okay, it's trying to tell me to shut up. I guess it won't let me unmute. But I mean, the thing that occurred to me while you were talking about that was, I don't know, I wonder if Porgy and Bess would have existed if not for white supremacy, and the fact that, Black people would have had more of a platform to write their own stories and the way that they wanted to write them. I mean, from a wide range of topics. I think that some of what's going on now, and I'm hoping that enough of it is happening that something has started to crack. And we're talking again about this particular world that I'm very acquainted with, which is the Western classical music kind of things that have descended from Western European classical music, is that since George Floyd was murdered, there are all these attempts to let not only Black people tell their own stories, and I think they are extending it to, trying to have more queer stories and more, maybe Asian stories, BIPOC, et cetera, et cetera. I think that, so that's sort of the larger community, the gatekeepers letting more people in as a result of whether it was a crisis of conscience or just, the whole world saying something is terribly wrong here and saying, well, if the whole world is saying it, well, then maybe it's true. We didn't listen to the people before, but now the whole world is saying it, so maybe it's true. But I see more of an opportunity for people to then not just tell particular stories, like the stories of suffering, as if I would assume that Jewish people don't want to be 100% defined in their suffering, and we don't want to be 100% in the box of, if you're going to express art, it has to be about your lowest moments. But allowing perhaps more of a view of us, whether it's on the screen or wherever, as just people, people doing our thing. Maybe we're good, maybe we're bad, but we're people, and it's not just going through this crucible of slavery and civil rights and, all this sort of stuff. I mean, you can have just you're a love story, just a love story. And yes, who we are informs how we do things, but I see that as, that's not specific to our communities, but I think that, in bringing some things out in the open, whether it's like, do we condemn someone like Kanye West, or do we give him a pass? Or, if you talk about, like, was old Hollywood really treating Black people with respect? And if the people who were running those were of Jewish descent, do we say, yes, that is the case? And then you put it out there, you acknowledge the parts of it that are valid, and then you take a look at the rest of it, which is that, okay, if 5 people are running something and they happen to be Jewish, does that mean that all Jews are holding us down? Or one idiot spouts off a bunch of nonsense, does that mean that all Black people hate all Jewish people? Or whoever is following that. But I think that, all these sorts of, when they have reconciliation, you have to be able to go there to say the thing that maybe in this situation gets you canceled, and have someone push back, and then be willing to listen to the fuller picture and what they're pushing back with. Is it backed up by facts? Is it, have they researched it, or is it just something that they're spouting off because they heard it somewhere? And I think that if people can have honest discussions where they are open to learning something, and maybe doing something differently. I mean, when you were talking about white presenting, I mean, there are Black people who were white presenting too, who did some of the same stuff, and they would be in the room and like a fly on a wall and not say anything because they didn't want to blow their own cover. So I think all of us who are in positions where we can speak to whatever things people think are going to be okay because they're just talking to us, that's a very micro thing, but I think the micro hopefully grows into the macro. And so when you have your friend who says something anti-Semitic, and you're just you Black people, then you push back. And the same, your friend who is Jewish. And I was actually, I admit, I was surprised when it came out after Whoopi made that comment that Jewish people did not consider themselves white, and that it was, but then I thought about it, and I thought about Italians weren't considered white. And some people still say, well, we're not white. And so what is white? It's just such nonsense, because you see all these people and their skin looks kind of the same, but they're not, or they had to earn their way into the club. And that's the sad thing. When some people earn their way into the club, then they forget that they were out of the club. They're just like, oh, I'm in the club now, so I can be like the people in the club, as opposed to this club is BS and it shouldn't exist. And, yeah, we want to be treated better, but there's so many more people who were not in the club, whether they were Irish, Italian, Jewish, Eastern European, and yes, they lost their accents, or there was ambiguity and they were allowed in. But if people just were able to look at the history and realize that for a lot of them, this club is this many people, and why are we supporting the club? Why aren't we just looking at it as a fallacious construct and going with that? But anyway.
I just want to make a quick comment here. I agree with that whole what is whiteness kind of question or idea, but still, the reality is still the presentation does matter. You know, how you present and come and enter various circles matter. And so if you are white presenting, then the odds are on the surface, you're going to have the benefit that someone who is black presenting will not have. And
I
so in
agree.
that, I remember you said that, yes, there are black people who are white presenting, and many of them would elect not to say or do anything because they didn't want to mess their own self up. And so that goes back to my original point of self-preservation versus cause preservation, going back to this bit of community. When are we as individuals willing and able to take a stand for the collective rather than just for us? But I get it, because it's scary to be all out there all by yourself, especially if you're in the face of potential danger, physical danger. I get that too. But it's still a question that I have and think about, just on the immediate. When people come out there, how they look is what people see first, and that's where they usually get the benefit of the doubt or whatever. Even as simple as the grocery store, going to cash a check. I go and cash a check, and my white friend go and cash a check, but my white friend is Jewish. But on the surface, people only see white. I'm gonna get all kind of mayhem and whatnot about, you need to show me X, Y, and Z for my check to be any good. And this person over here, oh, you're good. And they might have wrote a rubber check, and I actually have money in the bank. So that matters. And I'll stop right there.
I do think that this is a significant obstacle because the Jewish community doesn't, and I don't mean to speak for the entire Jewish community, but I do think that there is a significant portion that doesn't think of themselves as white. And so that comparative suffering or challenge or whatever it is, often from a Jewish perspective, I think that piece is left out of the conversation. And if we could overcome that construct, because you're right, whether we think of ourselves as white or not, many of us look white. I think that would open up conversations in different ways, at least from my experience, especially some of the experiences that I had in Birmingham. But I want to go back to what Maria mentioned about the cancel culture, because I feel like that's something certainly our entire country could commit to doing, so that we're sharing our perspectives and growing together. But I see that a lot in the Jewish community, is that as soon as there is that hate or we hear anti-Semitism, our first reaction is to shut it down instead of educate or have a conversation. And it's really hard sometimes to have those conversations, but I think that truly is what would help move us forward in those situations.
You know, I'm glad you said that, because I think what I've heard, you know, shared so far, there's this idea of, you know, I think both you and Donna, you know, sharing, like having to, the bravery, right, that's needed, and the commitment that's needed, the kind of mindset that's needed to be willing to enter into a conversation in a dialogue with our respective communities, and to stand up, you know, with and for one another when we see each other being abused and marginalized. And I think, and that takes an intentionality, that takes a kind of bravery. And with this idea of like, what, you know, what could it look like to, you know, start those kinds of conversations and start that kind of dialogue? You know, Maria said, you know, mentioned something about kind of the use of the broad stage of the arts, as it were, to tell our stories, and have our stories, you know, be able to educate one another. Their stories, like from us, you know, about us, and to the broader community that can provide, an avenue for education and also an avenue for, or a space for just presenting our whole humanity, right? Because it isn't, just all about, this is how I'm suffering and this is how I've been suffering, right? But we are all more than that thing. So kind of this idea that could look like a jumping off point for these kinds of conversations could come from the broad stage of the arts. I'm wondering, are there any other ways that come to mind that you think could be good jumping off points for these kinds of dialogues and conversations and interactions and relationship building as it were to happen?
I mean, I guess ideally, they talked about, I don't know who said it was about our places of worship being the most segregated hour. And so, I mean, I was just thinking, like, do we not cross paths? I mean, there's been so much effort to, you create these enclaves and they feel comfortable. And I know, like, the times that I grew up in a predominantly white area in Western Canada, and going to Bermuda or Jamaica just felt like, oh, I can relax now. Oh, wow, this is so good. But I mean, on the other hand, if you stay in that enclave, then of course you're not really having real connections and friendships. And so with people outside of your group, and I know, like, and I understand this, you go to the university. I went, to a school that was predominantly something other than Black, and we had our little table in the cafeteria. If you were in the cafeteria, you're looking around and maybe you see other people who are your friends, and it wasn't like those were the only people that I knew. But, you would tend to sit with the other Black kids if they're all together on one table. And I'm not giving an answer of where we have these things where we really interact on a, it's almost like you have to intentionally join organizations that are not so race specific or group specific or whatever, however you define yourself specific. Whether it's volunteering or just find a cause that allows you. Now, I think if you are, though, from a marginalized community, I mean, I know I've had to learn to be comfortable, and from day one I had to, otherwise I don't know how I wouldn't have survived, being in these white spaces and just being who I am anyway. So to seek out more opportunities to be in a white space and have them interact with me like I'm, I just am who I am. I mean, that's not necessarily something that people who are marginalized are constantly seeking, because you usually have to deal with that on some level, and you're seeking to be in a situation where people kind of have this way to understand you based on your shared experience. That tends to be the way that it goes. But so I didn't really answer the question, but I think that if we wanted that, if we want that sort of thing, we have to just go into whatever spaces that we're in and just be ourselves, not try to assess what the space requires from us, but just go in as we are and, be willing to be transparent, vulnerable, whatever. And that's the way to form those relationships. But, oh, I see something. Okay. I'm reading something from Portia about Halo doing something that was kind of similar, but I can't. Yeah.
It's the intermediate. I'm sorry. I was just speaking about an opportunity Halo had quite a while ago, maybe a year ago, and we were able to attend an event, and it included leaders from a multitude of faiths. And the program had each leader come up and sort of, I think it might have been for Thanksgiving, but it was a very edifying moment where we were able to glimpse into the values of different communities. And I thought it was a really interesting and a really great opportunity for us to sit and to listen to the approach of, and from a faith perspective. And I think arts is a really great beginning or jump off point, but really a program, not necessarily in a church or in a house of faith, but an opportunity for each community to bring their leaders and to offer their own perspectives into one subject, like giving thanks. So I just wanted to, when you have time, read the experience, but it was really edifying for me in particular. So that's it.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that and remembering that, Portia, because yes, it was such a beautiful experience and that kind of thing where there was this window into sharing the resources of faith orientations and values that have this these similar themes of the belief and desire to invest in the caring for one another and the world as a way of serving God, source, and however one names this divine creator from which we all have come. And something else that Maria, you said, and I know that you have to leave shortly, and we'll hold, I'd like if we could hold the space for a little bit longer to at least explore some more of this when we're talking about, even in Maria's absence, this idea of what could it look like for us to combine our resources to make a different world. And Maria said something about, if you're not part of that club, and she's alluded to the fluidity of the stratification and structures of race, and how some people flow into being identified as white, whereas in the past, Italians and so forth, like they were considered outside of that bracket, but now they've kind of come more into it. And for a time, Islamic Muslim people were more the target of racism, and then it turned into Asian and so forth. And so, it shifts around, it moves, and what that means, and about who's allowed into the club. And it made, it gave me the idea, raised the question of, well, what does it look like outside? Because the club, yes, that little clubhouse is very small, it's very insulated, and that group is not invested, those values are not invested in the care for the much broader and bigger world in which it is also embedded and is going to be affected by what happens in that larger space. So what might it look like if our respective communities were to turn more outward from looking at what white supremacy has erected as a social construct anyway, and to say, what are the needs of the world? And, these different marginalized groups, and how do we bring them into the margins, or reestablish the center of where we are locating our sense of place in the world? So through music or whatever, but I would love if in our closing, folks could share about that. And if there are any questions from those who are present with us for this dialogue, we welcome that as well. And Maria, we know that we have to say goodbye to you, but thank you so much for sharing and being part of this. So Donetta or Sam, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I love the idea of looking outward and doing that together, and thinking about how do we, and maybe this is not my thought always goes to how do we make it actionable and how do we sustain it? And I don't know, maybe that shouldn't be my first thought of maybe the first step is just thinking about what that looks like, and that's enough to get us to the actionable and sustainability. It just all feels like this is something that I struggle with, and I think that especially as my son, who is Black and Jewish, is getting older, I think it all just doesn't feel like enough. And I'm just sharing that personally, and that's my internal struggle. So yeah, I don't know if any of that just made any sense or not. But
well, what I feel like I heard from you is that you had an idea, a thought came to mind, and it felt too big, because it's well, what do the steps to that even look like? So what would it be if you were to dismiss any ideas of nothing ever being enough or things not being attainable? What was the thought that came to your mind?
I think about it starting with our children and what that looks like, not not elementary school, but early childhood. Like, what does it look like to teach our children, regardless of whatever community, race, ethnicity, religion that they identify with, to look outward, which is very hard for children to do, for all of us to do, but especially developmentally children. Like, what does that look like? I don't know what it does, but I think that's what felt really big, because I think it would make such a difference. And at the same time, how do we do that? And maybe it's through the arts. Maybe it's through the arts.
That's definitely a way, and a beautiful way, and an attainable way. And I think that's a wonderful direction in which to look to our future, to the children we raise, and how do we, because we can put them in the world that we want them to be in, and we can use boxes for all they care, where, you know, we can shape that for them. So yes. Donetta, what are your thoughts?
Well, honestly, I do apologize. I stepped away for just a bit. So if you could really quickly tell me what I am addressing. I'm so sorry.
No problem. What are we talking about? Portia was kind enough to put it. I was like, girl, so the question
is not, it's not as thorough, but what might it look like for our prospective communities if we decided to look outward from the social construct, aka the club, and start to address more pressing questions such as what does the world need? How do we address the bigger outward community instead of focusing our energies on the small, distinct little club and their rules as to how to get into that club?
Ooh, oh my. I'm honestly not sure how best to answer that. I know that I am routinely in spaces with people who don't look like me. I'm routinely in those spaces, and as Maria was talking, I was thinking about how in many of those spaces, I don't get to bring all of me to those spaces. At least I don't feel safe sometimes to, and so I think I have to continue to go into those spaces and gradually add a little bit more of me so that we get to know one another. I think we have to be intentional about having more relationships, more gatherings, more opportunities for interactions. And yes, it could be music, it could be the arts, but it really could just be as simple as let's have dinner together and talk, or let's go I don't know, go somewhere together and talk, eat, and find out about one another. But again, I again find myself always or frequently in spaces where I don't look like me, and then when I come back to my own community or to my own home or whatever, there's a bit of a relief because I can kind of let down some of the guards that I've had to have up, if that makes any sense. So I don't know. I guess it really will go back to what Sam said. It may have to start with the children, because in my observation, the small children get it right. We ruin it. I mean, because I remember one day I was on my way to a workshop for CEUs, and I was parking my car in this garage, and while I was waiting for this parking attendant to do something for me, this other passerbyers came by, and there was a small kid in the back seat of the car, in the car seat. This kid looked out the window, saw me, and started to blow kisses at me, and was just loving on me. And I thought, well, isn't that special? He or she was not afraid of me. They didn't look like me, but they were giving me love. And I thought, this just starts my morning off wonderful. It was beautiful. So the kids get it right, but I don't know, after they pulled off, I hope the parent or whoever was driving them didn't do anything that would change that behavior or that attitude. But I don't know. That's a big question. But I think we are going to have to be in more spaces of people that aren't like us, and gradually find a way to be more comfortable to be who we are, but recognize that sometimes parts of who we are may not be accepted, but we still have to be who we are. I don't know.
I will say, I think, hearing that I think just reiterating the intentionality of, leaving our respective spaces, going into other spaces, creating shared spaces that may not exist yet for these conversations and these relationships to grow is very much key in terms of, it's essential to looking outward, right? And looking for, how do we establish those connections? And as an affirmation, Sam, I will say that starting with the children does feel resonate as very actionable to me. I think, whether it's, through the arts, whether it's through the language of faith, which also resonates very deeply with me. And I think with a lot of, especially with a lot of the African-American community, particularly of certain generations, moving back, that resonates very deeply as opportunities for more connection. But even outside of those, how, intentional we can be with the spaces that are created for our children that allow both them and us to look outward. I think about how, I think oftentimes, parents talk about like how their friend group looks different from having children to once they've had children. It's because of just the frequency of association by proximity, because of the people your kids are, the other children that your kids are around and they want to be around and want to spend more time with. And, our children, by virtue of being themselves, right, already take us out of some of our safe spaces. And what could it look like for that to be embraced and even more intentional, right?
Yeah, and I think about the idea of being in the same space, and I'm going back to that because our JCC, where my son goes to preschool, has had a fire. And we are a predominantly white Jewish preschool. And we are in a space right now that another preschool that is not predominantly white is in. And our two groups are coexisting in the same preschool. And other than like celebrating Hanukkah together, which I don't mean to diminish, what else have we done to be really intentional about creating a space within the space that we're in, where we're learning about one another and having that exchange? Because we pass each other in the hallway, but is that enough? No, that's far from a start. So people within those spaces have to be committed as well, which I'm stating the obvious, but the space is the easy part. I think it's what you do with being in that space together that is, most important, obviously.
Yes. Do we have any questions or thoughts from those who have been sitting with us and bearing witness to this conversation? Yes, Celeste.
Thank you. I very much been enjoying this conversation, because from all the different perspectives, you all are pretty much on point with where people's minds and hearts have been. And I looked at the documentary. There's someone, you all had in the link about what led up to this discussion. And I recognized so much history there that I have lived through, and watching the anthology in essence of a history of how this has been so weaponized to keep two groups who are marginalized at odds, which is what the oppressor does. The language of the oppressor is to divide and conquer. That way they stay in power. So whoever you want to identify as the oppressor, that's what that little box of that little club group we've been talking about is, the oppressor. How you keep power, you keep everybody else at odds with each other. So when you think of us as being the marginalized groups, we need to come together and work as community to overcome and outnumber and therefore outweigh and change the policies that they have so carefully constructed over generations and put in place to maintain the power. So one of the things that is important to that, the arts, of course, are always a wonderful expression, but it starts to me with faith. And when the faith communities can come together, and starting with the children, as one has already mentioned, you start with the youngest generation. And as the adults, we want to emulate what we'd like them to learn. But if we have them in classes of virtues, because all the scriptures, all holy scriptures teach virtues of God, no matter what name they wish to call him, it's the virtues of God. And if they're all learning that together in their communities, they will begin to unlearn the bad practices if we, the adults, don't emulate those bad practices in our homes, something to counter that. So the children will inspire the adults to behave better. And I say that because I'm a member of the Baha'i community here in the United States. And we have a program. We have a program that says we want to build vibrant, spiritual, outward-looking communities. You don't have to be a member of our faith to do this, but we need to work together as community to achieve this. And we can change the whole flavor of what America looks like now.
Absolutely. What a beautiful reflection and set of insights, Celeste. And interestingly, the Baha'i faith, that occurred to me in some of the listenings to certain things about this. So, and here you are. Yes, and we've had this experience of walking down the streets, especially if you're downtown or driving down the street, and seeing church after church, synagogue after synagogue, building after building that is a community of faith of some orientation. And they have nothing to do with each other most of the time. And so just in the world of, okay, we want to get the children connected, we want to get ourselves connected, and we are aware of these generally shared values about serving the world, serving the source we serve and the creator we acknowledge, by meeting the needs of the world around us and in which we are a part. So we can identify some of the spaces. There are children there, and it sounds like that's a pretty actionable step. And your faith community, the Baha'i community, has such a program. And I can even share, we can get just a little bit of a link of information from you and include in, some of the description of this, like just one resource that folks can go to. We can continue in a conversation. But it's just neat to see these stepping stones of action, not just toward action. These stepping stones of actions are not far from our feet. They're just one step away in so many different directions. And so thank you so much for sharing that. Are there any thoughts or questions?
I would just like to say that this discussion was so fruitful and valuable, and I'm excited to see where we go from here as far as, coming up with ideas to bring these ideas into fruition and to, move forward. And we talk about being intentional, and that means coming up with an action plan. So I'm excited to see how we move forward, because I am very interested in broadening my horizons and learning about other communities and how best to serve them. Because Ms. Celeste was talking about, learning values, and one of those is serving. And so as we serve others, it brings us joy. And so I am very excited to see where we move forward.
Yes, beautiful. Thank you, Portia.
Absolutely.
The excitement and inspiration is contagious. So it's beautiful. All right. Well, thank you so much to everyone for being here. Thank you to Donetta Hawkins and Maria Thompson-Corley and Sam Dobrinsky for your presence and your having taken the time to reflect on the questions that we shared today and being brave and beautiful to share this with however much of the world is going to circle back and watch and witness this. And thank you to Celeste, Portia, Carrie, and Adam for your presence and bearing witness and being part of this moment. And we look forward to sharing this and hope to see it be an inspiration to that many more people as things that they can do today to start looking outward. So thank you, everybody. You have a wonderful day.